Greetings ladies and gents, and welcome to this match video for Mud's mission taken from the website Royal Road. As always, I hope that you all enjoy this episode, and if you do, please consider supporting the channel. Also, all of these episodes will be available as a podcast on the various different podcast platforms. All the links will be down below. Chapter 25, Mask. By the time Ghoul finished his second cup of tea, he heard the sound of the front door crashing open and then slam shut. Rapid footsteps made their way towards the kitchen, and the exhausted-looking teenage girl came through the door. Thagi gently put down his cup and looked at the girl up and down. She had grass stains on her shoes and some leaves stuck in her hair. "I thought you said you were going to get your brother." Jibrax inclined her head and looked at the bashful look, poking the tips of her index fingers together. About that. I tried to chase him down in the woods, but, he said he's too scared to come in because there's a scary-looking, She looked directly at the association leader and cringed slightly. He's scared of strangers. Walking quickly past Thagi, the ghoul approached the large kitchen window and pushed aside the curtain. He said that he would talk to you if you didn't have to come inside, though. Ghoul looked outside in the treetops. It took only a moment for his sharp eyes to spot it. Sitting up on a high branch and gripping 3 other nearby branches with a strange tentacle-like appendages. The things, which Ghoul assumed was Jibrax's brother, had a very strange appearance. He seemed to be about as large as a normal adolescent boy, or perhaps a little younger. It was hard to tell his exact shape, as he had draped himself with a heavy black cloth, which had been ripped into thick ribbons at the bottom edge. Each ribbon seemed to move about independently of the others, as though they had a life of their own. The face of the boy was obscured by a clay mask with 2 deep eye holes, and the only markings were 3 red large painted eyes, in the style of a vision rune. Considering the boy's uncle, it was likely that these were active runes and the mask was a magic item. The tree that the boy sat in was roughly 50 units away, so even for the association leader's excellent sense of sight, it was difficult to make out more details through the heavy garb. Keeping his eyes on the boy, Thagi turned his head to Meld. "Is that what you saw before?" Meld's eyes also locked on the strange child and nodded. "Yes, sir. Those strange movements, the dark coloration, the red painted eye are exactly as I remember. I believe he had a hood down last time, but this is definitely our guy." Susie hopped up from her chair and placed her hands on the window. "The stalker was some little kid like that. Why is he over there, though? He should be come inside. The leader's really scary, you know. He probably scares kids all the time. I bet a lot of them run away when they see him in town, right?" Ovis turned cheerfully towards the giant in question. Thagi's face tightened and then fell. "That's, not untrue." Before he could continue, Ghoul caught a whiff of mind mana entering the room through the window. Taking a few deep whiffs, he noticed a connection being sent to everyone in the room. To make so many connections at once, this kid certainly had some decent processing. As the leader allowed the amateurish illusion to take a hold, a monotone voice of a young boy suddenly became audible. "Hello, I'm Mud. I'm Jibrax's brother. I accidentally hurt this party with my spell. I'm sorry. Do not kill me or wipe out my mind." At the last line, everyone present, even Jibrax, was slightly shocked. Did he think that it would kill him just for overcharging a spell? No wonder the kid was spooked. Moments later, Jibrax tried to back up her brother. "Please, understand, he never knew how to talk. He doesn't really understand how to change his tone of voice yet. As far as killing him or wiping his mind, I'm not sure we got that idea." Thagi laughed it off lightly and stood up. "Don't worry, I understand. He probably heard recently about how bandits are dealt with in this country and got confused. As long as he learned his lesson, it's no big deal." The leader walked towards the kitchen door and motioned for the rest of the party to follow him. "Thank you for your hospitality, Jibrax. I think the boy has punished himself enough if he's that terrified. We'll be heading back to town now." As he walked out the front door, Ghoul looked into the woods where the boy had been sitting. As expected, he was already gone. The large man turned back towards the door, and the last of the group exited, smiling warmly at Jibrax. "One more thing before we go. You may have heard, but there's a Dungeon Wave festival in the town in 5 days from now. You and your brother should attend. It's a good way for young mage accusers like yourselves to gain some practical experience and to meet some people in town." The teenage girl smiled back. "Thank you, Leader Ghoul. Goodbye, everyone." Before they could reply, she slammed the door shut. Some time later, when all the humans were long gone, the golem in a heavy black cloak crawled into the mansion door. Once the door was shut and the blinds closed, Mud took off his ragged improvised robe and carefully stowed it on the shelf near the door. Sensing the location of the demon, the golem slithered towards the kitchen. Jibrax made a toothy smile towards Mud as he entered the room. "Oh, hello there, brother." Her smile shrunk into a much more smug form. "My plan worked flawlessly. I don't suspect a thing, and with this, our possibilities have been expanded. While humans are pathetic and weak, they can be very useful pawns. There are many things which are easier to get through sapient society than obtaining on our own." Looking into the air and dreaming of luxuries that were unknown to the young golem, she lifted a cup and took a slow sip of tea. Suddenly, all of Mud's normal movements froze. The posture straightened in a rigid motion, and all three of its eyes swiveled to stare rigidly at the demon. Although Mud wasn't moving, its entire body seemed almost to vibrate with barely constrained energy. Jibrax was slightly disturbed by the strange behavior of her already strange contractor. Suddenly, the golem's right arm shot upwards and pointed at a teacup. "What is that?" "Huh?" Jibrax looked down at the cup of tea. "It's some tea I made." At that comment, Mud began to visibly vibrate. "Those are the master's leaves." Large droplets of sweat began to form on Jibrax's forehead. Well, yes, but you said as long as they were used for the intended function, it's fine to use—" "Silence!" Jibrax gagged as her ability to speak was forcibly suppressed mid-sentence. The illusory voice was painfully loud now. "The master's tea leaves have been destroyed. It seems you do not understand. This mistake cannot be allowed to happen again. You need to be punished." The demon's re-education went on long into the night. End of chapter. Chapter 26. Muscular Minion. Several hundred years after the implementation of the Great Art, scholars began to realize that any entity with a soul can gain access to the Akashic records. At first, they feared the worst. Would predatory beasts rapidly gain strength of skills? Would every plant and blade of grass threaten to kill with unusually rare skills? As it turned out, such fears were unfounded. Simple-minded lifeforms simply did not have the intelligence or will to make use of such a complex tool as the record. Rather than being a disaster to humanity, this aspect quickly turned out to be a boon. By binding the soul of an inanimate object, it became possible for that thing to gain skills. As the object was mindless and had no will, the skills could not be used. While this at first was useless, scholars of the time saw great potential. Shortly afterwards, techniques were devised by which such objects could be forced to activate their contained skills. Other scholars, tackling this issue from the different direction, used existing automation magic to program simple personalities into such objects, and thus the two kinds of crafting were born, skill imbuing and ego smithing. Excerpt from the history of the Akashic records. Over the course of the night, the demon had repeatedly justified her actions as necessary to manipulate the humans, and thus protect the household. While Mud did not fully accept this excuse, it understood how useful is something as mundane as tea could be. Previously, the golem had even considered a small leaves to be part of a useful inventory. With that in mind, it seemed prudent to acquire a supply of simple items that were more readily disposable. Mud formed a bridge of mind-manner towards Jibrax, who was sprawled motionless on the floor. This was the first time the golem had seen the demon willingly resting on the ground instead of some invisible platform. Perhaps a sign of her extreme exhaustion from the night's ordeals. "We should purchase supplies from the human nest." The demon hopped up to her feet in a single motion, as if her previous exhaustion had been merely a ruse. "So we're finally going to infiltrate that city. I've been looking forward to it. There are so many, unique opportunities and places where the sapients gather." Jibrax rubbed her clawed hands together and revealed rows of sharply pointed teeth. in a gesture which Mud now suspected meant she was pleased. "Well, let's go then. No time like the present." Grabbing Mud's arm in passing, she began dragging him towards the door. "Stop! We cannot leave the mansion unattended in case the humans come. One of us should remain." Jabrax stopped, but her sharp-fanged smile didn't fade. "I thought you might say that, but I prepared for the situation." Turning towards the direction of the basement, the demon placed a petite, clawed hand to her mouth and yelled, "Oh, Jericho dear, come on out." Then she crossed her arms and waited. A shuffling noise and heavy, dragging steps became audibly, slowly climbing up the stone steps, and then trudging down the halls. Moments later, a figure in a thick human became visible in the doorway. Well, it was certainly the human that Mud remembered. He looked subtly different. His eyes looked vacant and unfocused, and his movements were unusually slow and flowing. Each slow step, he looked like he was nearly tipping over himself. A small amount of drool was flowing from the corner of his mouth. "Jericho, dear, would you mind the house for us while we're gone? If anybody shows up, tell them through the door to wait outside for us to come back." The thick human's head slowly inclined up and down twice. A smile appeared on his previously blank face as he replied with enthusiasm, "Yes, honey, I'll watch the house while you're out." His face immediately collapsed back into an unfocused blankness once he finished that sentence. "Can we trust this human to perform the task and not flee?" The demon giggled and headed towards the front door. "It'll be fine, I have him under my control. Jericho, punch yourself in the stomach." The rather muscular youth punched himself as hard as he could in the stomach, and momentarily doubled over in pain. Soon after, he stood upright again, and the same blank expression. The only difference was he was wheezing. "I see. Why not use the other human too?" Mud grabbed his cloak from the nearby shelf and fastened it around itself firmly. Jabrax rapidly absorbed her wings and tail to take on the form of a human teenage girl as she grabbed the doorknob. At the golem's question, she scowled. "That one is too well known by the locals. I might lead to problems if he's seen here." After taking one more look at Mud to make sure he was suitably disguised, the pair left the mansion and began walking down the trail towards the town. The pair traveled side by side down the winding mountain trail, although the sun had only recently risen. The dew on the nearby plant life was already starting to evaporate. Without a cloud in the sky, it would likely be a warm day. What would be the most useful things for me to acquire in the human nest? The demon squinted and her mouth scrunched up slightly. Mud suspected that meant that she was thinking. Likely trying to scheme up an answer truthfully which would lead to Mud dying and her safety. Eventually she relaxed and turned her vision back towards the path. The things that you might help you most right now, buying simple supplies, finding ways to earn money, buying useful enchanted items once we have more funds, fostering goodwill and useful connections from the humans, and, Jabrax hesitated, her face tightened. She appeared to not want to say the next part of her sentence, but was being compelled to by her contract. Getting a class. The fact that the contracted demon didn't want to suggest a class made it immediately attractive to Mud. Since Jabrax did not want Mud to know about getting a class, it was likely that it would vastly increase the golem's survivability. Of course, it was also possible that the cunning demon was merely pretending to not want to say it as a double bluff, but Mud discarded that line of thinking as useless. As always, the golem would simply follow the demon's advice while being vigilant for how it might be a trap. What dangers should I be wary of in the human nest? The thing that looked like a teenage girl laughed. Dangers to us? The ones that should be worried are the humans. Suppressing her mirth, she continued, well, there are a couple things to look out for. During the remainder of the trip to Galtheus, Jabrax explained the various threats to be expected for a monster infiltrating an urban environment. She was, as it turned out, an expert on the subject. End of chapter. Chapter 27, Mugger. Two small figures entered the outskirts of Galtheus in the early morning light. The larger of the two was a teenage girl with long, fluffy maroon hair, wearing light clothing and a pink tank top and black shorts. Besides her was a much shorter figure, about half her height. His figure was obscured by a heavy black coat, completely unsuitable for the hot summer and warm climate of Galtheus. Behind him, the ragged end of the cloak extended nearly a unit, dragging limp behind him. Vision of his face was obscured by a clay mask, although his proportions suggested he was a child rather than a smaller race's. The girl kept her eyes ahead, and the pair walked down the unpaved dirt streets between the rows of tightly packed single-story wood homes. The child, on the other hand, constantly turned its head, seemingly fascinated by every aspect of the city. Strangely, he even looked up at the clear summer sky from time to time. Andre smiled. Easy marks. As the duo walked past the alleyway between the two houses, their path was blocked by a rough-looking man. He was only in his late 20s, but life had not been kind to Andre. A combination of alcoholism and too many nights sleeping passed out in the streets had left him with a nasty complexion. His history of bar fights and pointless violence had left him with an ear and a nose cartilage in rather unique shapes. "Hold it! There's a toll for passing through this area," came the deep guttural sound. A slightly sour and rotten smell escaped from his mouth along with these words. To his delight, the girl quickly cringed back in fright, a look of terror clearing her eyes. Looking down towards the child, he clicked his tongue as he continued looking around. Perhaps the kid didn't realize what was happening. Didn't really matter, as long as he got some money and could get drunk tonight. From the teenage girl, a trembling voice finally came out. "I never heard anything about a toll." Andre leaned his head back and loomed ominously over the much shorter girl, revealing a smile with several gaps where his teeth should be. "You're new around here, aren't you? If you want to travel through these slums, you gotta pay me. Those are the rules." At that, he held out one of his heavily calloused hands. "Now hand me your money." To his surprise, it was the child who immediately placed a large pouch of money in his hand. The pouch was considerably heavy, much more than he was hoping for. Opening it to check inside, he was delighted to find several flashes of gold. His revelry was cut short by a short feeling of something wrapping around his legs. Looking down, he barely had time to register that his legs had become tangled in the child's cloak when a massive blow slammed unseen into his chest, winding him greatly and throwing Andre sprawling onto his back. As the large man gripped his chest and tried desperately to get some air into his lungs, the child calmly walked over to his body towards his head. Getting unexpectedly attacked was not unusual for the thug, and he quickly adapted to the situation. With a grateful, guttural yell, he rolled over towards the small figure and used his momentum to land a powerful punch directly to the boy's head. It felt like punching stone. Andre gripped his hand and winced in pain. Was this kid wearing a helmet under those robes? Without even flinching from the heavy punch that ended countless bar fights, the boy responded with a fist obscured by the heavy cloak. Andre then discovered that the boy's hand, too, was as hard as stone. At this point, Andre realized that he had made a mistake. They weren't just some ignorant kids from the sticks sent to do some shopping. These were some nobles' kids who probably had more levels on him despite their age. Assuming that they didn't turn him over to the guard and have him executed for assaulting nobility, Andre would make sure to spread the word to his friends. Don't mess with these kids. Those were his last thoughts before the rock-like fist distended again. Mud reached over to retrieve the money pouch from the unconscious man. As a move to strip him, the golem was stopped by the contracted demon's soft voice. "Wait!" Taking his clothes would draw the wrong type of attention. Jibrax's eyes scanned the nearby alleyways, spectators quickly retreating behind corners and covering windows as she did. As it is now, everyone who knows that will think that we have a powerful backer that helped us get stronger than our age would suggest. She looked down at Mud, who was about to take off the thug's stained shirt, and shook her head. "If we start robbing broke people with their filthy underwear, they'll wonder why we would bother. And when things don't make sense, people start paying closer attention and asking questions." Jibrax walked next to the man and gave him a sharp kick to the side. "For now, let's just leave this bum and see continue on our way." Mud took a long look at the useful resources it needed to abandon. Ultimately, maintaining its disguise was more valuable than the man's belongings. Still, it was a regrettable, inefficient course of action. Thinking back, the golem wished that it had known about the concept of selling things before the trip to town. There were likely valuable bits of beasts that were left to rot in the forest when it had hunted previously. Mud vowed that it would find out which monster parts were the most valuable before it hunted again. Mud turned back to the direction of the center of town, and the two monsters continued their journey. As the pair traveled through the town towards the west side of Galtheus, the quality of construction slowly rose, from the single-story shanties to the outskirts to the larger and more sturdy wooden homes. Eventually, they reached a landmark which was visible even from the very edge of town, thanks to the perfectly straight streets, the tall stone wall surrounding the city of Galtheus. The wall was nearly 10 units thick and as tall as 3-story building. Each section, which was as long as the city block, was composed of a single massive piece of seamless stone. The sheer scale made it immediately apparent that it was not constructed from mundane means. The top of the wall was studded with murder holes and battlements at regular intervals. The defenders were not limited to only the exterior edge. Instead, the wall also had defenses aimed towards the interior of the cities as well. The only apparent entryway to the top of the walls was a staircase located on the interior of the walls as an arched passageway which allowed traffic through. The passage itself had raised metal portcullis on both ends. Along the top, lookouts stood and watched at regular intervals. There were only 2 guards at the archway itself, although they were lightly armored and hung their helmets on strings from their belts. Their weapons, long spears, rested against the nearby wall as they played cards. They were there, it seemed, merely as a formality. Traffic traveled through the gate unimpeded. Jibrax and Mud walked confidently towards the archway. At the moment Mud passed the threshold, the golem felt a strong compulsion to stop and turn back. Mud had been warned of magical beast wards, though, and did not falter. A much weaker version of the ward was also encompassed the slums, so it was not overly difficult for Mud to ignore it the second time, despite the increased strength. It was merely annoying. Continuing out the archway onto the cobblestone streets, Mud took in its surroundings. Compared to the rather run-down and shoddy look of the slums, the interior was filled with a sturdy brick architecture and was bustling with activity. This was the real city of Galtheus. End of chapter. Chapter 28. Market. Many sapient races have expressed dissatisfaction over the decades at the common practice referring to all non-human sapiens as demi-humans. The term itself is annoyingly broad, including such desperate races as beast-like beings blessed by Yelberboeth and winged children of Teviot. Despite the rather reasonable gripe, even the so-called demi-human races still often refer to themselves as such. Why is this, and why do the creations of Logos receive special treatment? The reason is, of course, the Akashic Records. Having been crafted by human mages, the system in many places shows a strong human bias. It's no surprise that when omnipresent, seemingly all-knowing teacher for all rational minds uses the phrase, it sticks. Excerpt from the history of the Akashic Record. In contrast to the other rather lethargic feel of the slums, the interior of Galtheus was bustling with activity. Even on a wide main street extending from the archway, the citizens needed to weave and jostle for space to advance. Not that applied to Mud and Jibrax. The crowd gave the duo a wide berth as they traveled down the cobblestone streets. Much to Mud's satisfaction, the streets were very much cleaner here than in the slums. The golem didn't spot a single piece of refuse on the wide streets. Swiveling its head around to absorb as much information as possible, and to reduce blind spots in case of an ambush, Mud examined the composition of the crowd. The vast majority of the population appeared to be humans. Only rarely did the golem spot an animalistic features or distort the profile of a demi-human. Amongst the humans, the most had an olive complexion, curly black hair. Rarely, Mud would spot a human with vibrantly colored hair in various shades. These humans, like Mud and Jibrax themselves, were carefully avoided by the passerbys. In terms of fashion, light clothing and bright colors were the norm for both human and demi-humans alike. Mud stood out from the crowd as it was a heavy black coat, which would be stiflingly hot to any sapient in a quickly warming and humid summer morning. Having no specific destination in mind for the moment, the pair of monsters continued to descend the gently sloping path towards the west side of the city. After several blocks, the aged brick homes made way for storefronts and restaurants. Shortly ahead, Another large road intersected with their own. Both sides of the thoroughfare were packed with carts and blankets filled with all manner of goods, from fruits and vegetables to household supplies, and even live animals for sale. In the middle of the street, large groups of crowded around the buskers plied their trade, playing stringed instruments and performing feats of acrobatic prowess. As the golem slithered forward to examine the exciting bazaar, its movements were halted as Jibrax roughly grabbed its arm. "Wait, listen very carefully to what I say next." Mud turned its attention towards the contracted demon. After lowering herself down to squat and stare at the golem directly in the eyes, Jibrax began speaking carefully. "Mud, the humans in the market will tell you to buy their products or to shop at their store. This is not an order. It is a suggestion. When they say things like, 'Get your fruit here,' that's slang for, 'You can get your fruit here if you want, but you don't have to.' Nobody here is going to give you an order, even if it sounds like they are. Do you understand?" The golem took a moment to try and comprehend what the demon was saying. Mud would be getting things that sounded like orders, but are not orders. It seemed strange that humans would phrase things in such a misleading way. The demon was bound by a contract that restricted her from lying, so it must be true. Once again, Mud was perplexed by the irrational actions of humans. "I understand. The humans are phrasing things in a misleading way as part of their trading customs." Jibrax let out a sigh and stood up. "Good. I was worried you'd be running around buying everything if I didn't warn you." "Yes, that would have happened," replied the golem in its usual monotone voice. At that, the group began browsing the market. Over the next hour, with Jibrax taking the lead, the duo purchased large amounts of simple items that seemed useful. Foodstuffs, tea, bales of cloth and various shades, paints and candles, along with other small items. Everything purchased was stuffed in a haphazardly into a large burlap sack, liberated from bark when he came to extort them. Mud hefted the bulging bag, which was now larger than the golem, over one shoulder. The unusual sight of the heavily cloaked child carrying a burden larger than himself drew many curious glances. Content that she had enough luxuries to enjoy herself for a while, Jibrax crossed her arms and nodded in satisfaction. "All right, this should be good for a while. Let's head home." The demon turned back to get his way that came, but was stopped by the monotone voice of a contractor. "No, I must acquire a class." Jibrax turned towards the golem and pouted. "I was hoping you forgot about that." The demon began looking around, scanning the nearby shoppers. "Fine, you'll probably just pick something useless like maid anyway." "Hey, excuse me." Jibrax reached up and tugged the sleeve on a scrawny teenage human who was trying to decide which carriage to buy. Yes?" The boy momentarily froze as he saw Jibrax. A light smile formed on his lips and a slight blush appeared on his cheeks. He brushed back the curly hair with one hand and slightly stammered. "Hi there, do you need help with something?" Still holding onto his sleeve with 2 fingers, the demon leaned forward and looked at the charmed teenager. "Well, I'm new to the city and I'm a bit lost. Could you maybe tell me where I can get a class change in the city?" His smile grew deeper and flattered at the attention of such a cute girl his own age. Of course. There's a few places in town, but the closest is probably the Delvers Association branch by the dungeon. In fact, I'd be happy to show you the way myself." The boy stood tall and thrust his thumb towards his own chest, putting on a display of bravado. Jibrax opened her eyes wide and placed a hand on her mouth. "Oh, you would do that? You're so reliable. But I don't want to interrupt your shopping." The teenager waved both hands dismissively and beamed brightly. Not a problem. It's no trouble, really. In fact, I'm happy to help. Come on, I'll show you the way." "Well, if you insist." Linking her arm with the boy's, whose face now resembled a tomato, the pair of monsters were led by the oblivious human towards the next destination. End of chapter. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please consider supporting the author from the link down below. Otherwise, if you wish to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so, like liking, subscribing, and possibly even becoming a patron. Otherwise, the easiest way would be to share. And until the next video, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.